The polls have now closed in the UK in an election that could finally end the long-running Brexit battle. It's the third general election in the last 5 years. Prime Minister Boris Johnson has promised to take Britain out of the European Union next month if his Conservative Party achieves a majority in Parliament, while opposition leader Jeremy Corbyn says he will hold another referendum if his party wins. Last night, the two men made their final pitch to voters.
We're going to get Brexit done. We're going to get Brexit done. He'd have another referendum on the EU. That's what he would do. And I don't know what you feel, but I think whether you voted Leave or Remain, I think it's time for this country to come together and move on and honour the will of the people of this country.
It is a very clear choice. You go down the road with Boris Johnson, a sweetheart deal with Donald Trump, you break off any serious relationship with Europe, or you go down the Labour way, which is the adult, responsible way of negotiating a settlement that we will all live by and I will make sure is carried out in the future relationship with Europe.
CBS News foreign correspondent Mark Phillips is in London and joins me now. Hi, Mark. What would a victory for the Conservatives mean for Brexit? Would it mean an immediate exit?
Well, according to what Boris Johnson has pledged, it'll mean that he will take the UK out of the EU by the end of January. That's the next deadline that's coming up. And it would appear that should he win the big majority that's being forecast here this evening, that he'll be able to do exactly that, because the split in the House of Commons, which he had to endure up until this vote, and which was the reason why he called this election, has now broken, and it seems to have broken in his favor. We only have, I should say, an exit poll to go on at this point, but the exit polls here are quite comprehensive. They involve more than 25,000 people. They're taken in voting districts up and down the country, and they prove pretty accurate in the past. And the exit poll that has now been released here is showing a very substantial majority for Boris Johnson and his Conservative Party. There are 350 seats in the House of Commons behind me, and he's projected by this exit poll to have a majority of at least 86. That's enough for him to do effectively what he wants. And what he said he wants to do is take Britain out by the end of next month, and I think that's what we can look forward to.
And so there was high turnout then in this election.
I'm not sure exactly what the turnout figures are. They're generally pretty high. This one, of course, was a winter election. It's cold, it's damp, but it does appear as if the turnout was in about the range it normally is, which is in the low 70s. It's the kind of average turnout here. I don't know the exact figure here. And I'll stress, this is an exit poll. These are exit poll figures that we're dealing with, not the actual results. They'll come in over the course of the night, but it would be a pretty spectacular mistake if this poll was wrong to the extent that the prediction of a Tory majority government isn't going to come true.
And Mark, do the polls show you that Brexit itself also remains popular? And my second question is, to a lot of Americans who are sort of confused, Brexit has been in the air for so long now. Hasn't it in all effects already happened? In other words, companies have been anticipating this for so long. Haven't they already made their contingency plans, moved out of London if need be? Or is that just partially happening?
I think partially is the word. We'll see what happens now. I think as a result of this vote, some things are already happening. The result even of this projection, of this exit poll projection, the pound is already on the rise tonight. A lot of companies have made contingency plans, but nobody knew exactly what kind of Brexit UK was going to have, and in fact that's still not clear. What seems clear now is that this divorce agreement that Boris Johnson has negotiated with the EU will be put into effect. That provides a 2-year interim period for the next trading arrangements with the EU to be worked out. That will affect trading arrangements that the UK has with the rest of the world. So the exact shape of the economy is still in some doubt.
Right.
But yes, as you say, contingency plans have been made. People have opened offices outside of here. But just where the chips fall after this, nobody's exactly sure.
Right. All right. Well, Mark Phillips in London, thank you so much for your insight.
Okay.
For more analysis on the UK election, let's bring in Amanda Sloat. She's a senior fellow in the Center on the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institution and a former State Department official. Amanda, thank you so much for being with us. As we were just discussing there, voters in the UK went to the polls just 2 years ago, and Boris Johnson only became Prime Minister in July. Why does there need to be another election now?
So this is the third election in the last number of years. The Brits went to the polls in 2015, in 2017, and now again in 2019. Theresa May in the 2017 elections lost the Conservative Party's governing majority. She was dependent on 10 MPs from Northern Ireland's Democratic Unionist Party to prop up her government. Boris Johnson ended up losing that governing majority when he was in government, and that made it impossible for the government to get the Brexit deal through Parliament or, in effect, to get much of anything else done. And so a large part of the reason that Boris Johnson wanted these elections was to try and break the gridlock in Parliament, to go back to the people and, as seems likely, get a sufficiently large majority that he was able to get his legislative agenda, including Brexit, through Parliament.
So does it appear that Brexit is still the will of the British people, or if there were to be another vote, the chips may fall differently at this point?
This election was really complicated for voters. Certainly, Brexit was on the agenda. A vote for Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party was essentially a vote to get Brexit done. A vote for Jeremy Corbyn and the other opposition parties was a vote to have a second referendum. The problem is that Jeremy Corbyn, the head of the Labour opposition party, was extremely unpopular. He had a very radical economic agenda. There are accusations he has mishandled anti-Semitism within the party. And so it was a really complicated choice for a number of voters in terms of looking at questions of Brexit as well as economic issues. The other thing coming out of these exit polls concerns the situation in Scotland, where it looks like the SNP, the Scottish National Party, won 55 of the 59 seats up for grabs in Scotland, which is going to create a huge divergence within the UK. The Scottish National Party was supportive of the UK remaining in the European Union, but also has a long-standing platform for a second Scottish independence referendum and ultimately desires to have Scottish independence. And so we're going to see increasing divergence between Scotland and England as a result of tonight's vote.
So, interestingly, Brexit was perhaps the main focus for voters and the candidates, but as you just pointed out, certainly not the only issue that voters were grappling with. Would you say, though, if you didn't like the candidate but you liked where they stood in Brexit, they probably got the voters' vote?
It'll be interesting once we have more details on individual constituencies to see who won in certain seats. There's questions, for example, about whether or not Boris Johnson is even going to hold his own seat. There were a lot of attempts by voters to engage in tactical voting, so perhaps not voting for their preferred party, but for the party that they thought was going to deliver the best result for them on Brexit or on some of these other economic issues. So an incredibly complicated election for voters to try and contend with a number of competing factors.
And how will the results of this election impact the United States?
So from one perspective, this will provide a degree of clarity. There really has been gridlock in the UK over the last 2 years in terms of Parliament's inability to ratify Brexit legislation. If the results hold, as the exit polls suggest, it looks like the UK will leave the European Union by the end of January. The sides will then be able to focus on the negotiation of a free trade agreement between the UK and the EU, as well as between the UK and the US. So from an American perspective, there will be focus on this free trade agreement. It looks like we will not see hard infrastructure on the island of Ireland, which is something that there had been a lot of concern about in the U.S., particularly in Congress. And hopefully there will be the ability by the UK government to be able to eventually focus on issues other than Brexit, which has consumed an enormous amount of the political bandwidth in London and unfortunately will likely continue for the near term.
So let me ask you something. If Brexit goes through, what you're describing sounds like the UK will be leaving without a trade agreement in place. Isn't that what Theresa May was working so hard to achieve, a trade agreement?
So there's two parts to Brexit. What we are talking about now in terms of getting Brexit done has to do with the divorce. It looks like that will happen by the end of January, which is the current deadline. But that really is only the end of the beginning. The two sides then need to work out what their future relationship is going to be. The current transition period is scheduled to end on December 31st, 2020. Boris Johnson has said he is not planning to extend that transition period, but most analysts analysts believe it is going to be impossible for the two sides to sort out their future relationship within this one-year time period. So there's a lot of questions that have to be resolved. One of the biggest ones from the American perspective is the UK needs to decide how closely it wants to align with the EU on things like regulatory requirements. The more closely it aligns with the EU, the harder it's going to be for it to deviate from the United States, which is going to complicate discussions on things like environmental and agriculture standards, which are likely to be big factors in discussions about a U.S. free trade agreement.
And how has this gray area been impacting the UK's economy, this gray area that the country finds itself in, sort of in between places? You know, a lot of companies just say, look, I don't have the patience to wait around and see where the chips fall. We need to just move so we can get some clarity. So has the economy seen a hit at all?
It certainly has. We are now 3.5 years past when the Brexit referendum actually took place. There was a number of extensions. There were questions about whether it was going to happen, whether there was going to be no deal. And so companies have had to plan. So we have seen a number of companies that have left the UK and relocated elsewhere. We have seen some financial players move to other financial capitals within the EU. And it has created a lot of questions. Certainly with Boris Johnson's win tonight, we are seeing some more certainty entering into this. The pound seems to be rallying in response. But there has already been a certain amount of economic damage that has been done because of the length of this process and the uncertainty that it has created, especially for business.
All right. Amanda Sloat of the Brookings Institute, we thank you.
Thank you.